Where to from here? We will try to answer that question on this post-election edition of For the Record. I'm Neil Heinen. What we won't do in the next half hour is go over how candidates won or lost last Tuesday. That's been pretty well covered. But we will spend a little time on why races turned out the way they did and what the outcomes mean for our community, our state, and our nation. My guests this morning are three people who think and write about such matters as what's next. My colleague at Madison Magazine, editor Brendan Nardi, Capital Times columnist and blogger, among other things, Kaleem Kerr, and the editorial page editor of the Wisconsin State Journal, Scott Milford. Thanks, everybody, for doing this. Obviously, we're talking about a Republican landslide, lest anyone be, wonder just kind of how this is all sort of lumped together. I got to tell you, though, I got an email a couple of days ago from a guy who said that on the morning after the election, all three of the women on the morning show were wearing black, and that they owed us an apology if that was a political comment, because there were people from all parties watching it. I just thought it was really indicative of how a lot of people, how seriously they took this election. Yeah. Give me your impressions, just sort of the night, Scott.
Well, I think that Scott Walker's legacy, to some degree, is solidified with this. I mean, if you're a one-term governor, you're somewhat discounted. So he's now a two-term governor. He's won 3 times in 4 years. I think this helps his narrative going forward. And I think he was right in his analysis on election night when he said that people want to vote for something. They don't want to vote against something. And I sensed that a lot of people were voting for Scott Walker or they were voting against Scott Walker. There weren't as many people who were voting for Mary Burke. I don't think her narrative got out quite the way that she wanted to. And in the end, he won almost by as much as he did before. And
what were they voting for, though, Scott? What do you think they found appealing about the Walker performance to this point?
I think there are a lot of, most people are not in unions. Most people don't work for the government.
Right.
And I think most people saw to some degree that at the local level, particularly at their school boards, that the school boards had more say. I think people saw their property taxes pretty much stay where they were. I don't think mine went up, and I live in Madison for 4 years. I think people like that.
So they feel good about where they are right now, or they feel okay about where they are right now?
Well, and the economy has been improving.
Right.
I mean, he didn't get the 250,000 jobs. We all know that. But he did get 100 and some, and people are feeling more confident about what they're doing. And again, I'd go back to, he's a pro when it comes to being a politician and being a campaign. He's the kind of guy that can answer any question, whether he answers it or not, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And that's what politicians do, and he's really good at that. And, it's hard running a statewide campaign, especially your first time. And I think Mary sometimes stumbled on things that should have been strengths, whether it was being a member of the Madison School Board. Well, she didn't mention that on her website. She's strong. She had a strong jobs plan. We liked it on the editorial board. We thought it was forward-looking, but then the consultant copies a few things from something he'd done before. So there were just, I just don't think there was a strong narrative there for Mary. There was on paper, but I'm not sure it came out in person.
Yeah. Do you have one big takeaway from it, Kaleem, or just, your general impressions?
I had shared with people early on in the campaign when they'd asked me my opinion. I said, I think vision wins in 2014. People want to know, where are we taking the state? What is it going to feel like? What is it going to look like, the year or two after the election's over for me? And I think that outside of traditional Democratic strongholds like Milwaukee County, Madison, some of the southern counties, I think the Walker campaign has done a really good job of developing the narrative for what we're doing for you, for people all across the state in those other areas. I mean, I've been a couple of places with him when I was at the Urban League, and people love him. He gives them time and attention. He's very approachable. His organization have really paid attention to their technology needs and to their to resources for manufacturing. So for them, they see him as someone who can help us move forward. And I do think that the Democrats' message got lost in spending so much more time on him and not on a vision for Wisconsin.
Your impressions, Brian?
Yeah, I just think a lot of the commentary post-election was really, dead on. A lot of good writing and reporting about what happened. Uninspired kind of campaign, and not getting the right hit on the message. And I think she just didn't quite get there. And my job is covering Madison and the electorate here, and to Scott's point about not a lot of people are in unions and not a lot of people work for the public sector. Well, I think there's still a lot of that sentiment, and there's a lot of that still going on here in Madison, and we do still have that sort of still getting over Act 10 and what happened here. I mean, we were the epicenter for that, but last year when Mary first announced she was running, I ran into her and I said, wow, good for you for stepping into the fray. A Madison person who's done a lot of good work here. And she said, well, Brennan, it's not like I'm curing, I'm going to cure cancer or anything. I'm just running for governor. And I thought, what a great attitude going into it. And that I think speaks to Mary. And you alluded to in the editorial, her smarts, and she's a good person, good-hearted person. But I'm excited to have her back in Madison. Actually, she's done such good work on the school board. She brought in a superintendent, and she's helping to change the face of education here.
Right.
I think there's a lot going on on the state with what the mandate means for education. Already talk about changing the Common Core standards, but I really think her work here with the Boys and Girls Club and just being a really, really strong citizen and philanthropist and doer is gonna,
And
I thought that it was going to be important and maybe critical to have some conversation about, in the context of jobs, not how many jobs were created or why not, but that what is the future in Wisconsin for job creation? What are the sectors? And given the role that new technology and innovation and entrepreneurship is playing, at least in Madison and Milwaukee, and I think in Eau Claire and La Crosse and some other areas, that would get more attention. It was in Mary's plan, but it really didn't get talked about much. Did you think? I mean, wasn't that underplayed?
It was underplayed, and I think it will continue to be underplayed, unfortunately, when, Robin Voss is already coming out talking about, pointy-headed research and, we need to grow the right kinds of jobs and that sort of a thing. I mean, growing the right kinds of jobs are, public sector jobs, private sector jobs in technology. We need to look at the opportunities that are in front of us and take advantage of them. And investments in infrastructure and education and private companies is really the future, and we need to be looking at that.
Yeah.
It was kind of a blown opportunity by the Burke campaign, because you had a governor who, what was his biggest jobs initiative? It really was this mine. And not that we don't need mining jobs, but mining isn't the future of Wisconsin.
Right.
And then, he made a big to-do about poaching businesses from the border because we were going to have a better tax deal for them from the border of Illinois or Minnesota. I mean, there was kind of an old schoolness to that we've heard that's kind of the economy we've been. And I thought Mary could have stepped up more as an entrepreneur initially, as a company that does, is technology driven, the bicycle company that's global, which is something we stress in our editorial about her. I thought she could have made more of that point, that I'm looking at the future economy, not just the economy we have here now, and highlighting, which you allude to, is the research at Madison.
Well, when we come back, I'll start with you, Colleen, but we'll talk about the issues that still exist and how we address them moving forward. Right after this.
I was going to say Democrats.
I'm back with Scott Milfred, the editorial page editor of the Wisconsin State Journal, Brennan Nardi, who is the editor of Madison Magazine, and Colleen Kerr, who's got a new job you'll learn about in the not-too-distant future, but who also has started doing some writing and blogging for the Capital Times. And I mentioned new technology and entrepreneurship sort of as an opportunity for the state strategically thinking about economic growth and jobs. But there are a lot of things out there that were issues that maybe didn't get talked about so much, and I'm just wondering, from your perspective, Kaleem, what do we need to focus on now, and how do we do it with this, with the Republican majority that we have, and some of the wounds that still need to be healed?
You know, I still think it's the three big things: is jobs, education, and the environment. I think that those things are things that people still talk about, that people can still connect to. And I actually think that those are messages that people can find more unity around. You know, the challenge is that I see both parties having is that, you know, they're not speaking about those things in a way that capture the new generation of voters. You know, we talked about, you know, Milwaukee, you know, 50% of the votes showing up in Milwaukee. When you look at Milwaukee, what is its population? It's young. It's getting younger,
right.
And it's very diverse.
Yep.
And those are two populations that neither party in this particular state really spoke to.
And getting more affluent, right?
And getting more affluent,
yep.
That's right. And so I think there's a great opportunity, because they're the ones who are going to have children coming through schools. They're the ones who have children coming through schools now. They're the ones who are feeling the pinch of the economy, not by necessarily not having jobs, but by having jobs that don't pay them enough to afford the escalating cost of child care and housing and all the other things they're experiencing. And then as far as the environment's concerned, that population is much more concerned about, you know, what is happening to our climate, what's happening to the water and our community and things like that. And I just think that there is a generational divide that's underneath a lot of what we've seen happen across the country. And Republicans, although they won this round, they will feel that too when they go back to the polls 2 years from now and we vote for a president.
Do you have any sense, Brennan, that, I mean, in Madison, that there'll be a change in sort of how Madisonians look at the next few years as a result of this election?
Well, the mayoral race will be interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
in a way, that'll just change the focus,
you know,
right away anyway.
A young millennial is in the race, and whether he will win or not, maybe
Two young millennials.
Two young millennials, right? Bridget Maniaci and Scott Resnick. Whether or not they'll win, I think the conversation is going to change. That generation is much more collaborative. They look outside of politics for solutions to community problems, and I think the more that we can do what we're already doing. I mean, public-private partnerships, things like the Clean Lakes Alliance here in Madison have really done so much to sort of say, okay, if government can't be the end-all, be-all, fix it, what is that connection point where we can work together and solve problems and trust each other? Not that it's going to be big government or, you know, big business, that we can come together and do that. So I think the combination of the next generation and those of us who are in leadership positions now, what we can do to, you know, create a momentum to move things forward. I think we need to look at that.
You know, I really like that example of the Clean Lakes Alliance, because it was driven by the private sector, but it sort of created an opportunity where it was comfortable for Dane County to come in, or comfortable for the city to come in, rather than expecting them to start it.
And for private business to come in.
And I wonder if that's not a bad model. Yeah.
We're seeing it in education too. I mean, there's so much going on with the local, you know, Madison Metropolitan School District, and, you know, all of the different organizations coming together and saying, what are we doing right? How are we solving these problems, and how can we sort of coalesce around education or coalesce around the environment?
And those are young people leading those organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scott, we spend so much time, I mean, necessarily with letters to the editor and emails, and I mean, it's part of the world that we all live in. And that's where I think a lot of the divisiveness shows up. I mean, that's sort of a motivating factor for some of those folks. But I wonder sometimes if we then sort of get a little distorted in our thinking about how divisive it is, and that there aren't opportunities that for some common, you know, some common good sharing that gets ignored during run-ups to election.
Absolutely.
Do you believe that?
We talk about that a lot, particularly before elections, on how, you know, if we sell 100,000 papers and maybe 250,000 people read it, and then there's more on the internet, if 3 people call to complain one morning, you don't want to overreact to that. And you don't want to think that everybody out in the community is, you know, barking at your ear on something that's partisan minutia. And I think sometimes too, I even talk sometimes with our editorial cartoonist about this, that and who's also on our editorial board, but we do need to stay positive. And one thing we do at the start of each year is we do look at what do we want to work on that's going to be good for the state this year and that maybe has a little momentum. And interestingly enough, we asked Governor Walker, what's a sleeper issue out there that people are going to be talking about a year from now that nobody's talking about now? And he did mention these federal rules on carbon emissions, for example.
Yep.
Now, I think he comes at that issue as what's that going to cost the manufacturers and businesses and houses. But, you know, around that issue, the state is going to be the one that has to implement that. And there is that group, similar to the Lakes group, there's the climate lobby group, which
Yeah.
is pretty strong here, and
Yeah.
they're trying to figure out a model to that Republicans and Democrats can embrace, where maybe we do start charging more for the carbon that we're emitting, but we do it in a way that just doesn't pad government's wallet, and maybe we do it in a way that encourages innovation.
All
So,
right.
you know, I think there's issues there that we can
All right,
get at.
I'm going to follow up on that theme, and we'll do that when we come back right after this. I'm back with Brennan Nardi, Colleen Kerr, and Scott Milford, and we are wrapping up our conversation on the just completed fall election. The idea of citizen action on climate change and the environment does point out, to me, somewhat of a dichotomy that I think we saw in this election, and we've seen in the last year. It was a Republican landslide, and yet the momentum for same-sex marriage, the momentum for legalization of marijuana, the momentum around some citizen-based climate issues continues to grow and continues to be quite successful. Now, what does that, you know, Colleen, what does that dichotomy say to us about moving forward? And then does that translate to issues like equity issues and diversity issues and social justice issues?
You know, I don't know how much it translates, but I can tell you that Republicans in areas and communities where they need to speak about those things, they speak about them just like Democrats do. You're not seeing, you know, extremist opposition to those ideas. You know, we have same-sex marriage now. You still have occasionally the candidate who will go off about it in their very conservative religious district, but nationally, the National Republican Party isn't speaking really against that. So what I see happening with both parties is the Democratic Party has really lost a lot of ground in rural America around manufacturing, a lot around unions that used to exist in those communities. Those jobs aren't there anymore. Those people have navigated to a new party, one that's speaking their interest. And in urban communities, even though those issues were gaining traction on those issues because a lot more people identify with them, in the urban centers where they can count on votes, they're not really speaking the language of those individuals in those communities. The Democratic Party all across the country, I've heard from colleagues, they really didn't nurture the black vote until the last month of the election. That's not how you win elections, and when you're relying on urban centers to come out and vote en masse for you to win. The same-sex marriage issue, those folks vote at a high level regardless of whatever election we're in at the moment. So even though we've made traction on them, you're talking about 20 years of effort that went into that. That's not going to bring the people to the polls who we need to get to the polls who chose to stay at home.
Brennan, if I can just pigeonhole you on this, just I mean, women's issues were probably as divisive as any in this election. I mean, can you characterize how women are viewing this right now?
Well, I think to Kaleem's point that elections, the dichotomy to me is about the fact that elections aren't no longer about the issue, they're about the elections. They're about the dollars that are pouring in, and they're about the, you know, one party against the other and knocking each other down. So, you know, and I have thought a lot about the women's issues and what women around the state and here in Madison are thinking about, and I think what they're thinking about is very different than what the messages that are going out on as far as these campaigns. Even the commercials, you know, I thought were sort of off a little bit. Women care about healthcare, and it's not just, you know, am I pro-life or am I pro-choice? It's what's the best decision for me and my family. And so I just wish there was some sort of post conversation that we could be having about these issues instead of that left, right, back and forth, because I do think women care deeply about issues that aren't being discussed in the campaign.
Yeah, and I want to believe that that's possible, at least in the governor's office. I mean, with the legislature, I'm not so sure.
Well, I think at the state level, immediately here, there's going to be hanging over everything, is Walker going to run for president?
Right.
And if he's going to do that, that may change what a state budget looks like. He may be catering to a Republican presidential primary in other states. But I think at Washington, you know, there is some evidence that when you have this divided government going back to like Gingrich and Clinton, that you can actually get things done. And it has been suggested that, hey, maybe Obama can sit down with Paul Ryan from Janesville on poverty, for example. They don't agree on everything, but they agree on the earned income tax credit. They agree on trying to empower people. Maybe there's something there. Maybe they can get some of these trade deals done in a way that helps businesses without shutting down too many more factories. So there is, I think, some optimism for that in Washington. But back here in Wisconsin, I think the question is he going to run for president, and is there positioning that he needs to do there? I think he's accomplished a lot in Republican circles. He doesn't probably have to do or risk too much more, but he does say he's going to be aggressive.
All right, I don't know. We've got 1 minute left. I don't know if you guys got any you know, a little predictions rolling around in your heads. I do hear all the time that Russ Feingold has decided he's going to run against Ron Johnson, and I have not talked to him about it. And then there was an interesting piece this week on Paul Ryan, who was really talking seriously about the end of his career. Yeah. And that he sees the end in sight, and he doesn't want to do this forever. I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't really thought of that before with him. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think he's done yet. I think he still has a lot to do. But he is said to be more of a guy who comes back home, and he's got kids that are not that old.
Yeah.
So I think there's some truth to that, but he's got a long time ahead. I would just throw in, I think Susan Happ's going to be back. I think she was a strong candidate for the Democrats, and I think she'll run for something again statewide.
Right. Thank you very much for doing this. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you next Sunday on another For the Record.